time in human history, more people live in the city than in rural areas. This urbanisation new human rights potential, made more proximate, that can contribute positively to the lives This rapid urbanisation goes hand in hand with greater disparity, deeper inequality and more discrimination. It's past time to turn the corner. We must pave new ways, elaborate new means by which to open up new spaces for more human and humanising habitat. After all, there is no local government area, no village, no city, nor slum without people. And there are no people without rights. In and for the city, the village, the slum, human rights are at home, and there they must be protected, respected and upheld. Help us give this journey a real boost today with your welcome and needed reflections on the role of local government in the promotion and protection of human rights, universal and indivisible. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Mr. John Fisher to moderate the panel discussion. You have the floor.
Shukran, Mr. Vice President, Excellencies, distinguished colleagues. Let me begin by expressing my appreciation to the lead sponsors of today's initiative, particularly the Republic of Korea, together with Chile, Egypt and Romania, for bringing this issue to the Council's attention, for leading on the resolutions, and for enabling today's panel discussion to take place. I'd also like to thank, of course, the Deputy High Commissioner for her remarks and our distinguished panelists for the contributions that we're about to hear. The Deputy High Commissioner has reminded us that the story of local government is about more than just structure and infrastructure. It is, at its heart, a very human story, the story of the habitats in which we live and the communities in which we grew up, which contribute to our well-being and which shape our perception of the worlds in which we live. Here at the Human Rights Council, we often debate the responsibilities of states. And usually what we have in mind, and usually the recommendations that are framed in the resolutions adopted by this body, are directed to national and federal governments. But of course, it is all levels of government that have responsibility for implementing human rights. And it's local government which is often most closely connected with communities, with individuals, with civil society organizations. It's local government which makes decisions which arguably have the greatest impact on how human rights are implemented on the ground. When I used to live in Canada, I had a very good friend who was a local government politician. He was very good at his job, and people often encouraged him to run for the federal parliament. He would often say to me, "Why would I? It's here at the local level that I get to make decisions that have a real, meaningful impact on people's lives each and every day." He's now, by the way, the director of a children's hospital, which also, I think, is a reminder that it's at the local level that local government and local institutions also get to have an impact on economic, social and cultural rights, the right to adequate health care, the right to housing, education, water and sanitation. Of course, at the local level, there are also significant civil and political rights that are addressed by local authorities, including access to justice and whether to grant or deny a permit for peaceful protests. And there are many cross-cutting issues, such as non-discrimination and gender mainstreaming. As the Deputy High Commissioner has pointed out, many of these issues also find their place within the Sustainable Development Goals, and we'll hear more today about how the SDGs can be implemented and strengthened through engagement at the local government level. So just as the Human Rights Council has focused renewed attention in recent years on implementation of the resolutions and the principles that we adopt here, so too, it's only logical to now consider how implementation can translate into impact at the local level, and particularly through engagement with local government and their role in promoting and protecting human rights. The Human Rights Council Advisory Committee has made an important contribution in this regard, setting out both the challenges and the responsibilities of local governments, some of the things that they are able to do, some of the good practices, as well as some of the difficulties that they face. And so what better point to start our discussion today with our first speaker, Ms. Katarina Pabel, who is a member of the Human Rights Council Advisory Committee and was the chair of the drafting committee of the Human Rights Council Advisory Committee report. She is also a professor of public law at the University of Linz. And Ms. Babel, obviously the Advisory Committee report, which was issued in 2015, has addressed, amongst other things, the human rights obligations of authorities at the local government level and their responsibility to implement human rights in the daily lives of the population. I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about the inputs that you received, the process of the Advisory Committee in drafting that report, and the key recommendations that you reached. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice President, Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It's really an honor and a pleasure to present some ideas on the role of local government in the promotion and protection of human rights in this panel discussion. The Advisory Committee, as mentioned before, delivered a report on this subject and presented it to the Council at its 30th session in September 2015. The Council took the report into account. This report, provided by the Advisory Committee, provides a definition of local government in its role in the protection and promotion of human rights, and a legal analysis of the human rights obligation of the authorities at the local level. Furthermore, the report focuses on obligations of the local governments which derive from its responsibility for the implementation of human rights in the daily life of the inhabitants. However, work on the local level is rarely perceived as human rights implementation, neither by the authorities nor by the public. Consequently, human rights often remain distant in most policies and practices at the local level, while they may actually be human rights in practice. The Advisory Committee's report explained the idea and concept of Human Rights City, a globally developed initiative aimed at localizing human rights. It shows that this concept is a promising approach to develop a human rights governance in the local context, where local government, local parliament, civil society, the private sector and other stakeholders cooperate together to improve the quality of life for all people in the spirit of partnership based on human rights standards and norms. As requested by the respective resolution of the Human Rights Council, the Advisory Committee developed recommendations in its report. I want to mention only some of them. First, an analysis of the input given by several stakeholders showed that civil society plays an important role in boosting local action in the field of human rights in the respective countries. Therefore, one recommendation of the report was that civil society should actively be involved in human rights planning and implementation at the local level. Second, in the context of monitoring of the domestic implementation of international human rights commitments, the relevant United Nations mechanisms should be encouraged to engage in a dialogue with local governments as well. Local authorities could be involved in the UPR mechanism in respect of their government. This would improve the quality of the follow-up to the accepted recommendations in the UPR mechanism. Third, developments on the international level, for example, recommendation guidelines and examples of good practice, should be brought to the local level. Outcomes should be made more concrete and more practical for the specific needs at the local level. Specific areas that are highly connected to the effective implementation of human rights, as mentioned before, should be identified as such, and a kind of roadmaps for human rights implementation for these specific areas should be developed in order to facilitate the implementation by local officials who are mostly not experts in human rights. And finally, the report established a need to develop guiding principles for local government and human rights, taking into account various standards relating to the role of local government in implementation internationally recognized human rights. Such guiding principles, once adopted, would be a useful instrument to clarify the role of various actors and institutions and to develop concrete strategies in implementing the recommendations of the present report and other recommendations from special procedures of the Human Rights Council, its UPR mechanism, and UNTD bodies. To sum up, local authorities are close to citizens' everyday need, and they deal with human rights on an everyday basis. Local authorities take decisions relating in particular to education, housing, health, the environment, water, and law and order, which are directly connected with the effective implementation of the human rights. In this respect, a clear linkage to the goals of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development can be established. Decisions at the local level are thus able to enforce or to weaken the possibilities of citizens to enjoy their human rights. And particular attention in this regard must be regarded in the respect of the protection and promotion of vulnerable and disadvantaged persons and groups. Let me highlight two aspects to conclude. Firstly, to ensure effective local governance and an adequate implementation of human rights at the local level, it is important to have a proper legal framework and to provide adequate financial resources. And secondly, the strengthening of the local level for the promotion and protection of human rights should go hand in hand with the strengthening of democratic participation at the local level. Citizens should be empowered at the local level in participating, in decision-making, in control over policies. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pabel, both for that overview of the Advisory Committee's report and also for highlighting some of the concrete and practical steps that can be taken at the local level to engage with civil society, with other actors, to foster dialogue and to promote healthy human rights compliance at the local government level. Of course, it's very important to also hear from those responsible at the local government level for implementing human rights and for addressing some of the challenges that we have heard. And we are honored to be joined now by our next speaker, Mr. An Hee-jung, who is the governor of South Chungcheong Province in the Republic of Korea. Mr. An was elected in 2010 as governor of South Chungcheong Province and re-elected in 2014, serving 7 years to date in office to lead the local administration. In the 1980s, he was on the front line of the democratization movement against dictatorship, despite torture and imprisonment. He was elected as a member of the Supreme Council of the Minju Party of Korea, also known as the Democratic Party of Korea, in 2008, and he was a leading contender for the Minju Party presidential nomination earlier this year. Mr. An, you now have the floor.
감사합니다. 좋은 소개 말씀 감사드립니다. 안녕하십니까 여러분. 인권이사회 부의장님, 그리고 인권대표님, 그리고 참석자 여러분.
Good morning, Mr. Vice President of the Council, Madam Deputy High Commissioner, and all of you. I thank the moderator for his kind introduction.
정부를 이끌어 왔습니다. 모든 사람의 인간다운 삶을 위해
For the last 7 years, I have led the South Chungcheong Province as a politician and public administrator. It is the core duty of states as a guarantor of human rights to provide and facilitate social and economic foundations for people's quality of life. Instrumental values such as productivity, efficiency, and competitiveness often overshadow intrinsic values of human rights. So in this regard, we need to establish our perspective of growth and development, putting human dignity and sustainability of the earth at the center. I anticipate today's panel discussion will help us promote the role of the local government as a front-line duty bearer, most accessible to citizens in upholding human rights embedded in the Sustainable Development Goals. On this note, I would like to share the progress and challenges in South Chungcheongnam Province, included as one of the best practices in the report of the Council's Advisory Committee. In my presentation, let me put forward the following 3 points. First, human rights challenges as an urban-rural complex region. Second, the importance of multi-level governance through decentralization. And third, the role of local government for domestic implementation of international human rights obligations. First, Chungnam, 1/5 size of the Switzerland, has a population of over 2.1 million people. Chungnam enacted its own human rights ordinance in 2012, enabling us to establish Human Rights Commission in 2013, the Human Rights Declaration in 2014, and the Human Rights Center in 2016. Under local authority, the Human Rights Promotion Team deals with a wide range of human rights issues, and the Human Rights Watch Group of 150 members has actively engaged in numerous workshops. Through the workshops, human rights awareness trainings are held, neglected areas identified, and good practices shared. Further, the 2030 Vision for Gender Equality was adopted through public hearings last year. In this effort, Chungnam has made it a priority to address inequalities between urban and rural areas. As an urban-rural complex region, one of the major challenges to tackle regional disparities is to address limited access of rural communities to public services such as housing, healthcare, education, and culture, and others. The existing discussions on a human rights city, mainly highlighting the viewpoints of metropolitan cities, need to be further expanded to integrate the mutual linkage between urban and rural communities. Although urbanization concerns us with many social problems, we must not lose our sight of our challenges farmers and rural communities encounter. So in this regard, I'm closely keeping my eyes on a draft UN declaration on the right of pageant. Since taking office in 2010, I have developed and implemented the 3 agri-innovations initiatives, hereafter as a Samnong policy. The Samnong policy has close relevance to those social, environmental, and economic action plans under the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The principal elements of the Samnong policy correspond to the 5 pillars of the 2030 Agenda: people corresponding to farmers, planet to rural communities, prosperity to agriculture, peace to democratic governance, and partnership to international cooperation. This policy can be seen as taking a nexus approach to different sustainable development goals and targets. I believe that globally set goals assist states to realign their national policies under the international human rights framework and common task. As for the detailed information on the Samnong policy, please refer to the appendix as attached in the copies of the presentation. I have strived to mainstream human rights into Chungnam's local administration. Though some progress has been made, there are still some significant challenges in harmonizing each individual's human rights with the public good. I believe the solution only lies in building trust between local government and its citizens through genuine participation. Toward this end, Chungnam has sought various channels to better communicate with its citizens and civil society. The Samnong Policy Academy can be taken as such an example. Having been launched in 2011, this mobile academy allows public officers, including Governor myself, to meet with local farmers to engage in policy discussions. Multi-level governance strengthened through decentralization is essential for the delocalization of SDGs. It's been 22 years since the Republic of Korea adopted the local self-governing system in 1995. However, there are still too many restrictions to local autonomy in the management of budget, personnel, and others. As the advisory committee pointed out, the role of local authorities should not be limited to mere executions of decisions taken by the central government. As for the Republic of Korea, the Cabinet Council is the highest policy deliberation body, which only involves the Ministry of the central level. I made a proposal in the past to create a secondary Cabinet Council consisted of 17 heads of the metropolitan and provincial government. I hope through this amendment of the legal and institutional arrangement, multi-level governance can be strengthened. As the advisory committee noted in the report, the real effect of human rights is experienced at the local level. Nevertheless, local governments have not been able to participate in the Universal Periodic Review, UPR, and the work of human rights treaty bodies. Against this backdrop, it is my hope relevant institutional standards will be further developed. I would like to note that 7th World Human Rights Cities Forum will be held from 14 to 17 September in Gwangju City of the Republic of Korea, where municipal representatives, civic society groups, and researchers from across the world will gather to advocate for this council to work on a set of guiding principles regarding local government and human rights. Thank you for your attention to my presentation and to the experience of Chungnam.
Thank you very much, Mr. Han, for describing some of the policies and practices that you have taken to help mainstream human rights at the local government level, and also the importance, of course, of giving effect to the Sustainable Development Goals. We're fortunate, of course, in considering how best to advance the Sustainable Development Goals, to have a perspective from UNDP. And so I'm pleased that we are joined now by Ms. Sarah Sekenes, who is an advisor with the Conflict Prevention, Partnerships, Governance and Peacebuilding Group in the Bureau for Policy and Program Support of the UN Development Programme. Ms. Sekenes, could you please share with us UNDP's experience concerning how the Sustainable Development Goals of 2030, many of which of course have a basis in human rights, can be best implemented by local authorities? And I wonder if you could also indicate what processes and types of consultations can best facilitate this implementation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, Vice President, Deputy Human Rights Commissioner, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure for me to join this discussion on the importance of local government and human rights and the critical conditions for achieving the 2030 Agenda. Today I will concentrate on UNDP's experience of working with local governments to implement Agenda 2030. For human rights to be fulfilled and developments to be successful and equitable, we need more than national policies, plans and strategies. It must be locally owned. Localization of the agenda means that the design, implementation and monitoring of the SDGs reflects the priorities of the local people. Success in implementing the agenda and its commitments to leave no one behind will, to a large extent, depend on local action, community participation and local leadership. To leave no one behind is highly ambitious and goes right to the heart of the human rights principles. In practical terms, this requires transformational change at all levels. We need to look beyond the institutions of local governments to engage all local actors through a territorial approach that promotes the inclusion of civil society, traditional leaders, religious organizations, academia, the private sector, human rights defenders, national human rights institutions, local offices where they exist, and build partnership among all these stakeholders. It is about participation. As showcased by the recent Human Development Report 2017, despite the progress the world has made in reducing poverty, where it shows that 50% of the world's poor in 1990 are no longer living in poverty, many people are still left behind. Inequalities within and between countries are staggeringly high. The negative effects of climate change and environmental degradation are endangering our planet. Health pandemics are transcending borders, while war and conflicts continue to deny development and human rights to a significant number of people. This is why the central message of the new agenda is that development can only be sustainable if it includes everyone. As the Secretary General put it, this means that 7 billion people today, maybe 8 billion by the end of 2030, that everybody, without any exception, should be able to live sustainably and in a healthier way. No new global agenda can be attained if it is not adopted by the society and at all levels. And one of the fundamental lessons we've learned from the MDGs, that if the new development framework wants to respect its commitments and be truly transformative, an agenda, as we say, of the people, for the people and by the people, it must be fully realized at the subnational level. Local development is not solely about a geographical area, but more importantly the governance process of how and by whom local development is fostered and promoted. It is about inclusion and participation. UNDP supports subnational governments and other actors, including national human rights institutions, the private sector and civil society, to do just that, to design, implement and monitor SDG strategies and plans with the participation of local population. This partnership element is very important. No one can achieve this agenda alone. This means working differently than before, across the different sectoral delivery units within the government, with partners at the local level, and also at different levels of government to allow for a flow of information, mentioned also by other colleagues. It also emphasizes the need to work across the UN, providing collective agency support for the 2030 Agenda. An important condition of success is also the level of interaction and exchange of knowledge between local authorities, allowing to move away from the traditional expert input towards a model of decentralized cooperation that builds on the mutual exchange of expertise between local authorities and local development actors. By localizing the SDGs, we aim to ensure participation and inclusion of the entire population. We support local governments and other local actors to reach women and youth, as well as the poorest and most marginalized people. These groups often face multiple levels of discrimination based on age, gender, ethnicity, indigenous status, disability, place of residence, HIV status, or other factors. Local government have a key role to play in harmonizing local interests and creating a common development perspective required to prioritize expenditures at local level, also emphasized by other colleagues. Respecting basic rule of law principles such as legality, access to information, accountability, and the right to be heard must be integral in public service delivery at national and local level. To this end, UNDP and the UN system more broadly have established strategic partnerships with a variety of networks at local, regional governments and authorities. We are collaborating with the Global Task Force for Local and Regional Governments and UN Habitat on an online repository of tools and guidance for cross-learning between local and regional governments. And I encourage all of you who have good examples of working to promote human rights at the local level within the context of the Agenda 2030 to upload these experiences on this platform. More information in the circulated presentation. In localizing the SDGs and supporting local development, UNDP is already providing support to over 35 countries, many or most within the UNDG framework for collective UN support to SDG implementation. And what stands out in these efforts, such as, for example, Ecuador, Brazil, and Morocco, is a crucial need not only for building capacities, but also for bringing stakeholders together, for sharing information, for enabling local communities to voice their own needs, and ensuring that priorities are defined in an inclusive manner, and in coordinating the development of responses. There are obviously no one-size-fits-all solutions, and we need to recognize that considerable variation in mandates, capacities, and performance at subnational governments across and within countries. For example, in Ecuador, UNDP is working with the national and subnational government and with the Association of Ecuadorian Municipalities to integrate the SDGs into national and subnational plans and ensure the monitoring and review of implementation. In Brazil, UNDP partners with the National Confederation of Municipalities to strengthen the role of local governments in the localization of SDGs. This joint initiative seeks to raise awareness, to integrate the SDGs into their local plans, and to build up monitoring and accountability systems at the local level. We also facilitate the exchange of knowledge with other local governments and their associations in Latin America and the Caribbean with the Global Task Force. In Morocco, UNDP has supported Moroccan local governments in the setup of Maisons de Développement. These are focused on promoting exchanges and developing partnerships between all development actors. They become the entry point for development partners in the regions, providing them with a physical coordination space and a platform to harmonize and coordinate development efforts. But in this context, to conclude, I also need to emphasize the support in fragile contexts, such as in Yemen and in Syria, in which our support in cooperation with others strengthening service capacity at local level is imperative to maintain access to public goods and services that can, if not sustainably, at least help uphold the right to fulfillment of basic needs. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ikonis, and thank you in particular for your reminder that effective implementation of the SDGs requires local engagement and local ownership. Civil society organizations are often at the front lines of that kind of engagement. And our next speaker is Ms. Wanjiru Gikonyo, who is the national coordinator and a founder of the Institute for Social Accountability. Ms. Gikonyo, we'd be interested to hear your views, perhaps, on how one implements this framework in local engagement, how to close the gap between the rhetoric and the reality. What are some of the experiences on the front lines, and the role of civil society organizations in ensuring adherence to human rights standards at the local level? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Fisher. Good morning, Mr. Vice President of the Council, Madam Deputy High Commissioner, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor to be able to share my reflections, which are based on our work advocating for public participation in Kenya. through policy advocacy at the national and subnational level, as well as mobilization of local communities. I therefore bring a civil society practitioner's perspective of engaging with government, communities, organized groups at these different levels of governance. The African Charter for Popular Participation in Development and Transformation, Arusha 1990, captures perhaps the first concerted commitment by African governments to promote public participation. Crafted in response to the devastating effects of the Structural Adjustment Program, a one-size-fits-all remedy which worked in several Asian countries but ravaged service delivery in African countries, the Charter affirms that nations cannot be built without the popular and full participation of the people. It recognizes that popular participation is the empowerment of the people to effectively involve themselves in governance, opening up political processes, and so forth. I'll then move to the report that informs this session, the report of the General Assembly of 2015, which identifies very well the obstacles to effective public participation, which include the lack of political will due to non-democratic systems, as also found in incipient democracies. Sometimes you could say that's contested democracy, lack of institutional capacity. It identifies the lack of effective intergovernmental cooperation between national and subnational governments, lack of information about human rights requirements, failure to recognize the role of civil society organizations, and the absence of human rights obligations in national and governance frameworks. So these are identified as the challenges in implementing an effective public participation and human rights framework, which would apply at local government level. So having considered these challenges, I then want to contextualize my remarks in the situation in the African context and in the situation of countries that have already promulgated progressive constitutional dispensations, such as South Africa, Zimbabwe, Tunisia, and of course I'll be speaking from Kenya's perspective. Kenya in particular has ratified international conventions, established gender and human rights commissions, and an ombudsman, all of which are constitutionally protected to uphold public participation, human rights, gender equity, social and economic rights, and the whole, all these rights protections are constitutionally mandated. The Constitution has a progressive and extensive Bill of Rights. Devolution is also constitutionally entrenched. Public participation is enshrined as a national value and constitutionally required in policy, public finance management, natural resource management, in the legislatures, and so forth. The Constitution entrenches gender equity, economic inclusivity as core underlying pillars. Kenya has also, in this context, mainstreamed the SDGs, the 2030 SDGs, and as it had the MDGs before that, through its national planning framework, which cascades down to the local level. So the question that I want to address myself to is, in this context where you have progressive legislative, in fact constitutional framework, what are the lessons emerging from the implementation of public participation and human rights, and how can that inform our ongoing interventions? So I would want to speak to the first item recognized in the report as a barrier. Democratization of institutions continues to be a challenge. And democratization of institutions could be said to be one of the strongest indicators of political will. The extent to which political leadership entrenches horizontal accountability, separation of powers, provides clarity in lines of authority, protects public servants from executive interference through and within routine administrative processes, will enable or inhibit public participation. Democratization of information. Access to information is an enabling right for public participation. This has emerged as a big challenge through partial reporting, lack of access to relevant and useful information within government and to the public. So we have had instances where we are not able to get information about development processes as civil society, and also government officers at certain levels are not able to get this. Maybe the decentralization framework has not cascaded to the local level, but remains centralized at the sub-national government level. In this case, you can say that is an example of a lack of democratization of the institution and, of course, of the information needed to enable public participation. A second issue that emerges as a challenge in effecting public participation, empowered participation, is the conceptualization of public participation into minimalist administrative requirements as opposed to self-governance or self-determination. This is one of the biggest challenges, despite numerous practical examples of successful self-governance, especially at the local level. We have many cases of documented examples of successful service delivery by residents' associations in partnership with government. Yet these models aren't cascaded into, aren't then entrenched into the development model of local governance. So what happens is that local development tends to alienate the public from service delivery and from local governance in imposing models which still continue to be top-down, even though they are being implemented at the local level. It is my proposal that to effect public participation in local governance, we need to challenge the models of governance. I'll give an example. So, the goal to ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all is a key pillar of successful urban governance. However, getting communities to manage their own service delivery in solid waste management would entail removal of those resources which presently benefit government and a few cartels that have been able to capitalize on this service. This is replicated in the informal sector, and I would want to conclude, because unfortunately I'm out of time, that transparency, the issue of self-regulation, and the issue of revenue share has to be considered when generating models for local governance. Civil society is an important pillar in advocating for these alternative models, and we will notice that the operating space of civil society has continued to be constrained. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Gikonyo, and in particular, I think you've highlighted that the advancement of human rights at the local level is not a given, but is very much dependent on the kinds of structures that promote transparency, accountability, and participation. We're interested now, of course, to hear your views in terms of the experiences of your own states, and we will invite you through the Vice President to both offer your own experiences, and if you have particular questions to the panelists, then they'll be very happy to receive those and respond to them. With that, I now hand the floor back to the Vice President to conduct the interactive dialogue. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, we will proceed with the list of speakers. Let me remind you that all the interventions from the floor are limited to 2 minutes, and that the list of speakers is now closed. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Republic of Korea on behalf of a group of countries. You have the floor.
Vice President, I wish to extend my sincere gratitude to the panelists and also to Chile, Egypt, Romania, the co-sponsors of our initiative on local government and human rights. As local governments are closer to citizens, they are better positioned than central governments in dealing with human rights issues that are relevant to citizens' needs and priorities. Indeed, decisions that are made and implemented by local governments on a daily basis have real impact on almost all aspects of our citizens' life. The concept of localizing human rights is commonly recognized. However, the efforts to involve local authorities in the international human rights mechanisms have room to be improved. As the Advisory Committee of the Council points out, international human rights commitments could be implemented more effectively when local governments are actively involved. We hope that today's panel discussion will help us accelerate these efforts. The experience of South Chungcheong province, on which Governor Hee Jung-an has made an excellent presentation today, will serve as good guidance to other local governments. We agree with him that building trust between local governments and their citizens is crucial, and this trust can be realized through a constant flow of communication between them. In order to force an enabling environment for localizing human rights, local authorities need to be given sufficient policy autonomy. However, situations for the incorporation of human rights in policy making may be different not only from one local government to another, but also between local governments and the central government. In this regard, I'd like to ask the panelists what will be required to realize the proper coordination among them. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Now I call on the distinguished representative of Egypt. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We would like to welcome holding this debate on the role of local government in protecting and promoting human rights pursuant to Resolution 33/8, of which Egypt is one of the co-sponsors. We believe in the importance of the role of local government in promoting and protecting human rights for individuals and society as a whole. Our local governments are involved in the daily lives of our people and ensure a decent living for all of them. We have endorsed the Sustainable Development Plan of 2030, and we are calling for a just and united society based on equal rights and social, political and economic opportunities. Our citizens have the right to take part in this just distribution of resources, and we also seek on ensuring balance between all classes and groups of our societies. Our constitution states that the state shall support administrative, financial and economic decentralization, and a relevant law regulates the administrative management of local units. We have also a time frame for the transfer of authority and budget to the local administrations. We think that the local administrations are the link that links between central administration and the local government in provinces, cities and villages. Paragraph 14 of the report of the Advisory Committee mentions that it is important to have a legal framework for the local government. This law should clearly define the roles, responsibilities and prerogatives of the local government, as well as the relationship between the various central and decentralized administration. Our legislators in Egypt have also examined a draft bill in our parliament in cooperation with the Ministry of Local Government, and this law should be submitted to the parliament in the present session. Finally, we need to draft plans that are clearly defined in order to ensure local development whereby we secure equality and justice for all our individuals in our societies. My question to the panelists, based on their experience, what are the specific areas that are available for local government on which they can focus in order to promote and protect human rights? Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman.
Thank you. I call on the distinguished representative of Chile. You have the floor.
Presidente. Thank you, Chair. We would like to, first of all, welcome the presence of the Deputy High Commissioner. Thank you for being with us, and also thank the panelists. And also, I'd like to pay tribute to the Director of Human Rights in Geneva. In Chile, regional governments and municipalities play a key role in promoting and protecting human rights. And we have an excellent opportunity before us with the implementation of Agenda 2030 to enhance the role of municipalities at national level. Chile has included in its implementation mechanism of Agenda 2030 participation of local governments to ensure nobody is left behind. Regional governments and municipalities in their daily work as they implement public policies deal with issues related to childhood, health, education, housing, inter alia. It directly links them up to citizens who are human rights holders. In our country, municipalities are called on to implement a range of actions. That can be seen in the promotion and protection of the fundamental rights of girls, boys, women, the elderly, people living with disabilities, as well as the rights of migrants, amongst others. We have a real commitment from the comunas, as they're known, the local districts, in disadvantaged areas. This is linked up to the needs of the most vulnerable. For instance, the district of Quilicura in Santiago was recognized by UNHCR as a city of solidarity, paying tribute to the efforts it's made as a municipality to improve living conditions and foment local integration of refugees in their new communities. This recognition has been received by those municipalities far removed from the capital, such as Calera in the centre or Arica in the north. What's interesting in this process is that many mayors and many municipal officials have taken on their role as human rights guarantors. They're interested in knowing successful experiences from other countries so that they can replicate them in their comunas. Visits, international seminars and other meetings testify to that. Our interest is having the human rights approach being present throughout public policies, and that is why Chile believes it's vital that we have proper training of civil servants, of local authorities in the area of human rights, both within the national legislative framework and also bearing in mind international human rights standards. In this Council, there are a range of mechanisms to assist states in complying with their obligations. I'd like to ask the panelists, therefore, whether they could share with us their visions as regards how, in a tangible fashion, such mechanisms can support local governments in their role promoting and protecting human rights, bearing in mind the direct impact that they have and how close they are to the grassroots and citizens themselves. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I call on the distinguished representative of Madagascar. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I would also like to thank the Deputy High Commissioner and their panelists for their statements. Alongside other countries, Madagascar is constantly striving for human rights to become a reality across the country. Significant efforts have been made by the country's leaders to remedy the human rights situation, following the recommendations from the Universal Periodic Review in 2010 and 2014, and to involve local governments in the promotion and protection of human rights. Since the National Independent Human Rights Commission was established in June 2014, the government's efforts to mainstream human rights within local governments in Madagascar have broadly been focused on actions of awareness raising, training and education that have been organized in partnership with civil society and technical and financial partners. The goal is therefore to democratize human rights by expanding them across the country so as to contribute to better social justice. In addition to the public forums organized for public-focused activities, specific activities have also been conducted for local authorities, traditional leaders, religious chiefs, teachers, and so on, so as to, for example, eliminate harmful cultural practices, or in different contexts, to stress the importance of giving birth in health centers, so as to make it easier for people to acquire civil status documents and birth certificates, to educate people about the fight against the sexual exploitation of children, to implement the national plan to combat enforced child labor, or lastly, to advance the rights of women, similarly to what has been done in 2017, namely achieving gender equality when it comes to passing one's nationality to one's children in the context of a mixed nationality couple. In spite of the efforts made by the state, the challenges that local government has to overcome when it comes to promoting and protecting human rights remain manifold. They essentially boil down to poor infrastructure, to a lack of material and financial resources, and also the need for capacity building for relevant local government officials and civil society workers, and generally speaking these include police officers, gendarmerie, magistrates and social workers. The development of this relevant necessary infrastructure and structures depends on the success of the work already begun, such as the implementation of the legal instruments on human rights across the country, the implementation of national programs that contribute to this, in particular expanding the scope of citizens' advice and legal counsel centers that have been set up where necessary across the country. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I call on the distinguished representative of Brazil. You have the floor.
Mr. Vice President, Brazil highly welcomes the inclusion of the new urban agenda as one of the guiding documents of this panel. In the process leading up to Habitat 3, member states expressed the expectation that the new urban agenda would help localize the sustainable development goals. Accordingly, the participation of subnational and local governments not only marked Habitat 3 in its preparatory process, but also the role of these authorities was firmly embedded in the new urban agenda, thus strengthening the collective efforts towards the achievement of sustainable development. The Human Rights Council adopted last June by consensus Resolution 35/24 entitled Human Rights in Cities and Other Human Settlements, which we hope will contribute to localizing the promotion and protection of human rights. The resolution was inspired by the new urban agenda and its vision of cities for all, which have clear links with the work we have been developing in the Human Rights Council. In line with the new urban agenda, the resolution also noted the efforts of some national and local governments to enshrine this vision, referred to as right to the city, in their legislation, political declarations and charters. Brazil is one of the countries that recognizes the right to the city. According to our constitution, the urban development policy is carried out by the municipal government. It is aimed at ensuring the full development of the social functions of the city and the well-being of its inhabitants. The Statute of the City, a federal law enacted in 2001, strengthens municipalities and local governments in their task to implement urban policies in line with the right to the city. In this connection, we would like to ask the panelists the following question. How can the Human Rights Council support local governments to promote inclusive cities and human settlements and to ensure that all inhabitants of present and future generations, without discrimination of any kind, are able to inhabit and produce just, safe, healthy, accessible, affordable, resilient and sustainable cities and human settlements? I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Now I call on the distinguished representative of Romania. You have the floor. Microphone, please.
I beg your pardon? Is that okay now? Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I say, Romania welcomes and congratulates the distinguished panelists for their participation in this intersessional panel, for sharing their views and expertise on the role of the local government and in the promotion and protection of human rights. We also would like to express our gratitude to the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights for the support in the implementation of the Human Rights Council Resolution 33/8 and for their organizational efforts related to this intersessional panel. While aligning with the statement delivered by the Republic of Korea on behalf of the core group countries of the resolution, we also would like to say a few words in national capacity. Mr. Chair, the inextricable bond between human rights and public policy is based on an ever stronger awareness on the part of the citizens worldwide. This is probably the more visible at the local level, where the citizens' dialogue with the government is more frequent and concrete. As history shows us, human rights and freedoms are vital resources for development. At the same time, development can exist without a sound relationship between citizens and public institutions. Citizens are probably the most important, honest, and trustworthy allies of those institutions because it is about their community. 1 year ago, the Regional Development Ministry of Romania organized a 2-day forum on public local government under the auspices of the President of Romania, with a view to discussing the present challenges in front of the local communities and how the partnership between the central and the local government can be better shaped to the benefit of the citizen. It is worth mentioning that according to the one governing opinion, a high-performing local government should be of integrity, transparent, and working in a sound and functional partnership with the central government and the citizens. This is probably even more relevant in the context of the 2030 Agenda for Development. The SDGs are people-centered and human rights-based, covering all the civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. We believe it is our common task to facilitate the dialogue with the view to make the local government as efficient as possible in promoting and protecting human rights. We are confident that the outcome of the intersessional panel will help us in our job. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I call on the distinguished representative of Georgia. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Let me start by thanking Ms. Gilmore and our respected panelists for their valuable contributions. Today's discussions has once again highlighted local government's key role in promotion, protection, and fulfillment of human rights. In my country, local government bodies are an integral part of the relevant human rights action plans and are directly involved in ensuring that social, economic, and cultural needs of the local citizens are met, with special focus on the most vulnerable. Being a multi-ethnic state, Georgia strives to ensure full-fledged participation of ethnic minorities in all spheres of public life. With this in mind, the Civic Equality and Integration Strategy of 2015 until 2020 was adopted by the government. Subsequent action plan envisages a number of steps undertaken with close cooperation and engagement of local municipalities inter alia to increase access of minorities to the information and media in their native languages, to provide better education opportunities, and to promote cultural diversity. In parallel to concrete projects, the Georgian government puts a special emphasis on awareness raising and education campaigns. On SDGs, government fosters a dialogue to serve as a platform for the development of more comprehensive implementation mechanisms, building public awareness and engaging local stakeholders. In 2017, the government, in cooperation with the OHCHR, started a training cycle on human rights throughout Georgia for the employees of the local municipalities, with an aim to increase awareness of applicable human rights standards. All these efforts are directed to provide better protection of the rights of our citizens. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Now I call on the distinguished representative of Iraq. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. First of all, I would like to thank you for having organized this session devoted to facilitating the involvement of local governments and authorities in the implementation of human rights under Resolution 33.8. I would also like to commend Ms. Gilmore and the other panelists and thank them for their statements. I now have the pleasure to share with you our democratic experience in Iraq. Turning the page on the dictatorial regime that had reigned for decades. This involved the formation of governorate councils, as well as the adoption of Law number 21 of 2008, which gave the governorate councils the ability to establish legislatures and involve citizens in decision-making, the management of political, financial, and management affairs. And this does not run counter to the constitution. Quite the contrary. Part of the central government is devoted, central government budget is devoted to this, to allow the local governments to properly fulfill this role. These local authorities are supposed to facilitate the implementation of centrally adopted decisions, in particular in healthcare, education and security. Their role is also based on supporting citizens' involvement in decision-making and in identifying their needs. Here, I would also like to highlight the role played by local authorities when it comes to security in the fight against terrorism. And I would like to ask the following question. Would it be possible to tell us about some tools that the panelists think may be effective and able to better strengthen the role of local government in the realization of human rights at the national level? Thank you.
Thank you. Now I call on the distinguished representative of Israel. You have the floor.
Thank you. I would like to thank the distinguished panelists as well as all the colleagues who preceded me in taking the floor. While the extent of the powers entrusted with local governments differs from one country to the next, it would be safe to say that they should always play a role in the promotion and protection of human rights. The very fact that local authorities are typically close to their constituencies, both physically, culturally and otherwise, makes them an essential player in this context. In Israel, the Federation of Local Authorities functions as a link between the local population and the various ministries of the central government, advising it on issues such as planning, housing, water and education. This additional tier of elected officials and an accountable bureaucracy expands the democratic space and reinforces its legitimacy and credibility in the eyes of ordinary civilians. Local municipalities in Israel exemplify this important role first and foremost in ensuring that people have access to many of their basic needs, thus contributing to the promotion and protection of human rights. Adequate and affordable housing immediately comes to mind in light of the local government's key role in zoning and planning. In a region living under the threat of earthquakes due to the Great Rift Valley, local authorities in Israel are actively involved in the implementation of the programs designed to reinforce existing buildings, thus reducing the risk of collapse. But there is much more that local authorities do in this regard. Whether it is the regulation of water supply by local operators, the provision of hot lunches for kindergarten and school children, the facilitation of public manifestations ranging from political rallies to the gay pride parades, the provision of free Wi-Fi access and public hotspots, the installing of lifeguard services in beaches and swimming pools, and the creation of smart cities through interoperability of networks. Local governments play a crucial role in so many aspects of human life, thus contributing to the protection and promotion of human rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now I call on the distinguished representative of Indonesia. You have the floor.
And let me first of all thank all the panelists for their comprehensive presentation. As the co-sponsor of the resolution number 33/8 on local government and human rights, Indonesia would like to contribute to the discussion based on its own experience in advancing human rights in local governments. In the interest of time, I would like to share the following. First, strong leadership and commitment at the central and subnational level is required to make human rights more concrete and more predictable for specific needs on the local level. Two, capacity building on public servants at the local government level in promoting respect for and the realization of human rights in society should be continuously done. Three, administrative measures to translate the relevant issues of human rights protection into concrete measures to be taken or standards to be obeyed at the subnational level throughout the country should be taken. All of such measures are incorporated in our existing Human Rights National Action Plan, the National Human Rights Blueprint that was taken since 1998. Administratively, the Ministry of Law and Human Rights continues to provide guidelines in the realization of the government obligation on human rights through its regulation on the criteria of human rights performance of municipalities and cities in Indonesia. Indeed, each country has its own distinct characteristics and challenges in pursuing the SDGs with human rights approach. Therefore, continued sharing of best practices and cooperation are essential in promoting human rights and its protection and respect at local level. I would like to invite all the participants to the side event on adopting the framework of the SDGs in the implementation of human rights cities in Indonesia and other countries this afternoon at 3 o'clock in room 22. Finally, I would like to ask the panel views about the importance of sharing practices among cities in achieving the SDGs goal. I thank you then.
Thank you. I turn to the list of speakers of national human rights institutions and non-governmental organizations. Now I give the floor to the United Cities and local governments. You have the floor.
Buenos días.
Very good morning. I'm Mauricio Valente from the city of Madrid. I am representing the UCLG, United Cities and Local Governments. As the World Organization representing local governments, we are pleased to note that the Council is bringing forward the work to recognize the prominent role that local governments play in promoting and protecting and implementing human rights. UCLG has provided specific inputs to the work of the Advisory Committee. Several examples can be found in the promotion of local charters and action plans, monitoring mechanisms, training programs for public workers, and specific efforts to ensure human rights universality. We've also contributed to the definition of global human rights framework. We've given them global voice, and we have promoted the global charter agenda of human rights in the city. This is something which strengthens human rights. Despite this advance, we have concern regarding the current widespread context of human rights violations. We feel that 4 conditions are necessary to realize human rights locally: local autonomy and decentralization with competences and means, ensuring maximum available resources are there to fulfill economic, cultural and social rights, meaningful participation for civil society, and supporting the work of global city networks such as UCLG to develop guides, etc. We would invite states to develop their work to promote and monitor the implementation of human rights locally in a permanent dialogue with local authorities and their organizations and civil society. Also, that we see the promotion of decentralization and local institutional strengthening, as well as the promotion of the Global Charter Agenda for Human Rights, as well as advancing the recognition and promotion of the right to the city. We're ready to participate in defining specific measures to combat corruption and facilitate transparency. UCLG commits itself to disseminate the conclusions of the panels amongst its constituency and partner organizations, and we're ready to work with Council to further deepen and promote localization of human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the international NGO Indonesian Development. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. My name is BK Ulung Hapsara. I come from the International NGO Forum on Indonesian Development. I come here with the delegation from the District of Wonosobo in Central Java and the National Commission on Human Rights of the Republic of Indonesia. For the last 4 years, we have been working together to promote human rights cities and its adoption by more than 500 cities and districts in Indonesia. Mr. Moderator and distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we are happy to share in this distinguished panel that the promotion and protection of human rights by local government is very much compatible with the existing law and regulation in Indonesia, particularly the Law on Human Rights and the Law on Local Government in 2014. It is within this legal framework that as of today, there have been 5 cities and districts that already declare and have local regulation on human rights cities. Several more cities and districts are in the process of preparing to adopt human rights cities framework. This all could happen because of the cooperation between NGO like INFIT, local government like the District of Wonosobo, National Commission on Human Rights, and the central government, particularly the Ministry of Law and Human Rights. And also in this opportunity, I would like to ask the panelists, especially Governor An, on how to promote human rights cities in Asia and how to integrate human rights cities in localizing SDGs in Asia. And following my statement, following the development at the UN Human Rights Council on the issue of local government and human rights, Mr. President, the Human Rights Cities Network in Indonesia would like to convey the gratitude to the great work and express support and encouragement to the member states of the Human Rights Council to immediately follow up the recommendation of the Human Rights Council Advisory Committee, particularly on the importance of a guiding principle on local government and human rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we have exhausted the list of speakers. I give back the floor to the moderator and panelists to answer questions or comments from the floor. Mr. Fisher, you have the floor and you have 15 minutes. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Vice President, and thank you all for your comments, your statements, and your questions to the panelists. I think we've heard an excellent range of sharing of good practices, some acknowledgement of some of the challenges faced at the local level, and a good range of questions, particularly about how the Human Rights Council can remain engaged in this discussion and follow up to strengthen human rights protection at the local level. We'll invite each of our panelists to respond to the questions that have been raised and to what they have heard, and at the same time to make concluding remarks. My understanding is that we do have some flexibility in relation to the time, and we'll invite the panelists to share their views and concluding remarks in the reverse order that we heard them present their initial statements. So perhaps we'll begin with Ms. Gikonyo. We have heard a number of different questions relating to the importance of combating corruption and ensuring transparency and accountability, which I know is the focus of the work of your civil society organization, and also about how to ensure that there are adequate legal frameworks in place to maximize these kinds of protections and enhance transparency. So perhaps if you're able to comment on what can be done when these legal frameworks are not in place, what can strengthen this kind of accountability, and also any concluding remarks that you'd like for the room. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think legal frameworks are imperative, and we've all acknowledged that. Civil society plays a big role in terms of advocating for these legal frameworks where political will is not present. Of course, if there is political will, then that's a big bonus, where governments are leading the charge for establishing these frameworks. But beyond the legal frameworks is a culture change. It's about values and ideologies. And what we are finding in our setting is that there's different, there are a few aspects that still need to be negotiated or discussed in terms of how do you make these frameworks operationable? How do you make them deliver to citizens so that the frameworks aren't just about putting frameworks or just ticking the box? The first thing that I mentioned was the issue of bottom-up. We really need to interrogate the extent to which the frameworks, the development framework, the regulations, the development models, the funding structures are truly bottom-up. There are some very excellent community-based engagement models. A lot of them tend to be very localized on very small issues as opposed to applied to larger service delivery issues. This links to the issue of subsidiarity. Who needs to manage what at which level? There's a notion that community-based development is expensive, whereas in fact it's really expensive to have top-down models where a lot of the resources remain at the top level and very little goes to the local level. So that is the first challenge we need to address. I think Brazil talked about the issue of the human rights city and what they've done, which is really a competition between the notion of productivity and redistribution. This is another issue we need to challenge. For instance, when you're talking about a liberal markets context as opposed to a developmental government approach, where is the correct balance for this? Because we know that when private sector steps in, then you have the social contract between the state and the citizens somewhat diminished. So this needs to be put on the table, because local governance is about people making their own results and being a part of their governance, not being given governance and development structures as a fait accompli, whereby they become disconnected, and that's where cartels are able to come in. So my last submission is that proper bottom-up governance based on sound subsidiarity and based on principles of transparency is the strongest antidote for corruption, because when citizens are invested in their development, they will not rationalize corruption, which happens now, where communities rationalize corruption based on, well, that's our community, allow them to benefit from those resources because they come from our tribe or from our part of the woods. So I would say that we need to interrogate our ideological foundations from the very top level, national, regional, international, regional, and national policies to the local policies. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comments. And Ms. Eknes, we heard a number of stakeholders talk about the need for coordination at the local level and what can be done to strengthen that kind of coordination, both between different stakeholders at the local level and between different branches of government and different tiers of government, as well as with civil society. And we also heard some questions in relation to the difference between advancing, for example, the SDGs within an urban context, within cities, and in more rural environments. I don't know if in UNDP's work you've had experience in relation to how to facilitate that kind of coordination, and also perhaps the different kinds of environments in which these issues can arise.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. And perhaps also linking to the delegate of Iraq, also speaking about tools. I think the first thing in terms of looking at tools available, I mean, there are many tools available, but I think before going beyond the checklist, there is actually conclusions and recommendations coming out of the report of the advisory committee that serves to advance the checklist in terms of more programmatic interventions. And I wanted to come to some of these. I mean, one thing is that civil society should actively be involved in human rights planning and implementation at the local level. Are they? To what extent? And so on. That's one thing that should be checked. Local public officials should keep up ongoing dialogue with citizens and with civil society. Measures should be taken both nationally and internationally to strengthen civil society capacity to monitor and engage with local government. Central government is responsible for providing valuable information on human rights and their impact on the local level to local governments. Specific areas that are highlighted highly connected to the effective implementation of human rights at the local level should be identified. For example, if public services are provided at the local level, this can be identified as a field where non-discriminatory access must be guaranteed. Specific attention should be paid by any area of the local level being prone to corruption, especially the provision of public services. Local authorities should be involved in the UPR in respect of their governments. This would improve the quality of the follow-up to the accepted recommendations. And there's also a need to develop guiding principles for local government and human rights. That's kind of the first things that could be looked upon as a checklist. And when you've done that checklist, having the priorities of what needs to be further developed. And in that sense, I just wanted to go through, in response to the Ambassador of Chile's question on coordination, some of the programmatic interventions by UNDP and its sister and brother agencies in the UNDG includes 3 steps. One, importantly, is initializing the SDG process at the subnational level. And this includes something that has been proven very, very important, awareness raising of the population. There needs to be public awareness campaigns to understand what the SDGs are and what the right holders have the right to in that regard. And it also needs to be a discussion at local level of tailoring the SDGs to their context with needs assessments and selecting and identifying local goals, targets and indicators. So that's the first step of what we do in terms of helping local governments to coordinate amongst actors priority setting. The next step would be the institutional arrangements enabling SDG implementation. And these include strengthening the multi-level governance systems, both with vertical and horizontal policy coherence and implementation, inclusion of non-governmental stakeholders, and ensuring information flows between the different levels of government and the population. And again, reminding that the the responsibility for that information flow actually lies at the state level down to local level. We also work in coordination with others, or cooperation with others, in helping local government set up a territorial multi-stakeholder approach with groups at the local level, which brings together development, economic and social actors to ensure the endogenous potential, identity and priorities that are taken into account through inclusive and participatory processes that result in integrated interventions and coordinate such intervention. And also in strengthening accountability systems and capacities at the local level. And that includes support to information within the different units of the government and to the population, communication with governments and to external stakeholders, data management not least, and the collection at the local level of this data. Capacity at local councils must be built or strengthened, and inclusive monitoring systems, including community participation, must be strengthened. And anti-corruption mechanisms set up and strengthened. Lastly, in order to complement the initializing of the SDG process through awareness raising and institutional arrangements, we come to the enabling processes, which is indeed the capacity building. And there we heard examples of much of the good work of OHCHR in terms of decentralizing the training of government officials on human rights implementation. And this has to do with institutional capacity building itself and the leadership, but importantly, as I think mentioned by our Georgian delegate, at local level and not only at national level. And also facilitating partnerships building within the country, regionally and globally, with local authorities, such as exemplified by today, where the good examples of many countries, including the example of the governor from South Korea, can be shared as examples of good practice out there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Ahn, we had some questions in relation to how local areas can prioritize their attention to human rights issues, and that was linked to other questions around capacity and resources. So it'd be interesting to hear how, within the resources and capacity that local governments have, you determine priorities and are able to strengthen that framework. A number of speakers also referenced the importance of human rights training for local government officials, and I wondered if you had experience in how that kind of training may best be provided.
Yes.
So, let me provide my opinion about the questions that were raised. Among the comments that came from the floor, the Chile representative asked this question: how the Human Rights Council's efforts can complement or help the local government's efforts. In the comments and the questions made by the state representatives, I was able to find great insights, and especially the Chile representative's question is very important. First of all, the UN Human Rights Council has been led by very effective leadership, including our Vice President here today. The discussion that we are holding today is very important. I would like to emphasize that point first. Especially while I was in my teenage years, in the 20 years, I was involved in the democracy movement. I was imprisoned, I was tortured. So being here myself at this stage is very, very moving for me. However, the issue that we're dealing with, it can't be a politically sensitive issue, but we must go beyond fear of this becoming a too sensitive issue. So among the questions that were posed, with regards to the role of the local government, how it can be enhanced. Well, with regards to this topic, following the MDGs in 2015, the 2030 SDG was adopted. I believe, first of all, the list of the SDGs must be closely studied by the local governments. In 2015, for our province, for the entire public administration process, all the indicators that we use was made to correspond with the SDGs. We came up with over 100 indicators that corresponded with the SDGs. So we are using this indicator set. And with regards to new 2030 proposals, we are trying to incorporate this into our process. SDG is related to the sustainable future of the mankind. So in order to ensure this sustainable future, the local government, from industrialization to welfare issues, compassing the entire public services that we provide, the SDGs values must be incorporated into our public administration assessment process. If that is done, then I believe our local mechanisms can be very effective. So, in that respect, an SDG-based assessment of the local government administrative services. Why don't we come up with an evaluation process for this? And also, as been noted by some representatives, enhancing transparency is an open government initiative. Disclosing of information by the government. How can this be implemented? I have nearly 100% disclosure of the public government information. If there's any expenditure made by the local government, then for what purpose? In detail, information is provided. So it is uploaded to the internet, and all the local citizens can check this on a real-time basis. So we are disclosing information in order to ensure the political participation of local inhabitants, in order to ensure the effective achievement of the SDG goals. And so government disclosure of information is something that needs to be facilitated. And also, the local government's human rights promotion and the role of local governments in this regard, it should be further emphasized. In this regard, Korea, Chile, Romania, the co-sponsors of the resolution, I would like to once again offer my great appreciation. At the local government level, there should be further exchanges at the international level, further cooperation and collaboration at the local level, and through such efforts, the SDGs and the human values pursued by this very council can be more effectively implemented at the local level. So for this end, international cooperation among local governments is a goal that I am personally pursuing as well. So I hope the efforts of the local governments, if it goes hand in hand with the HRC's efforts, I think we will be more effectively able to achieve the SDGs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of our panelists for sharing their views and experiences. Our final speaker now is Ms. Pabel. Number of questions that focused on the role of the Human Rights Council in supporting strengthening human rights protection at the local level. Obviously, the Human Rights Council Advisory Committee has done its part in presenting the report, and I wondered if you had views in terms of what are some of the other tools and mechanisms available to the Council, such as the special procedures or UPR, which could help to carry forward this dialogue from here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And when replying to your question, I would also like to come back to some contributions and questions by the distinguished colleagues on the floor. I think what is really needed is to, let's say, translate human rights for the local level in order to make their implementation really effective. So what is lacking at the moment, in my view, is really a couple of guidelines, guiding principles, sharing your practices, monitoring programs, and so on. Also, what has been emphasized by many speakers, training and education programs of all local actors is really important. So all those programs, let's say, has to be developed. And of course, also the advisory committee would be ready to contribute to this development if requested so. This could be one element of a Human Rights Council effort in order to strengthen the promotion and protection of human rights at the local level. The more the presentations and the contributions by states and other stakeholders, in my view, showed that there are strong linkages between several ways and means to protect and promote human rights at the local level. What I mean is, we have the recommendations by the advisory committee, we also have some other recommendations, we have the OPR mechanisms, now we have the system of SDGs. And I think what is really important is to draw this linkage between all those efforts in order to promote and protect human rights. What is needed is, in my view, a kind of integrative approach of all those initiatives in order to combine the efforts. And lastly, I would like to highlight again the importance of participation and democratization at the local level, which is in a way a precondition for an effective protection of human rights. So what is really needed is that we give specific power to the local level. We empower also civil society at the local level in order to have this important pillar of empowerment of, just say, the people at the local level in order to protect effectively human rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And that concludes the comments from our panelists. I won't attempt a comprehensive summary of the discussions, but perhaps I will attempt to outline some of the key themes that have emerged. And I'm aware, of course, that the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights will be presenting a summary of the panel discussions, gathering together a number of the very good suggestions and recommendations that have been made, and packaging that into a report that will be presented to a future session of the Human Rights Council. We've heard from a number of both panelists and stakeholders in the room about good practices in order to facilitate the protection and promotion of human rights by local governments. We've been pleased to hear from the Governor of South Chung Chong Province about his experiences and some of the tools and policies that have been advanced in order to strengthen protection throughout that work. We've heard about the model of human rights cities, which have a framework for expectations and practical approaches that can be adopted by cities in order to advance a human rights framework. And many people have mentioned good examples where there is a positive dialogue with civil society organizations and active engagement in shaping policy and carrying forward suggestions for improvement of the human rights framework. We've also heard from a number of people about various challenges that are faced at the local level. In particular, we heard about the challenges that are faced in fragile contexts where there may not be the infrastructure or necessary support in order to carry forward a human rights framework. But we've also heard about sometimes obstacles such as restrictions on freedom of expression or assembly, corruption and the need to have measures in place to address corruption, the challenges in addressing the needs of the most marginalized within communities, including, for example, migrants, those who face discrimination on a variety of grounds, homeless people and others who are amongst those who are most marginalized. Many of you have emphasized the importance that human rights implementation be locally owned, and certain themes that emerged time and again were the importance of participation and empowerment. Obviously, this can require capacity and resources, and so ensuring that there is both political will, strengthened capacity, and adequate financial and other resources in order to carry forward a human rights framework were highlighted. A number of speakers indicated that it's important to have an integrated approach, that often human rights and other programs exist in different silos, and different agencies work on different aspects of local government and the carrying forward of their work. And that it's important to look at an integrated approach, both at the local level, across the different levels of government, across the different stakeholders, and also up to the UN, where different UN agencies can work together to ensure a coherent approach promoting and protecting human rights, in particular in the context of the SDGs. Of course, as I've flagged, the role of civil society was highlighted by many. And in some cases, it was noted that civil society can be key partners and stakeholders in carrying forward and supporting and strengthening human rights protection at the local level. In other cases, there are restrictions on the work of civil society organizations and NGOs, whether through registration laws that impede their work, restrictions on funding, denial of permits, or cultures where the work of civil society organizations is not adequately supported. And there was also a significant attention to the importance of the democratization of institutions, which continues to be an issue in a number of countries, and the importance of ensuring that those key pillars for effective human rights protection are strengthened. A number of our panelists highlighted the importance of measurability and indicators, and putting in place strong frameworks so that one can assess the extent to which local government authorities are meeting the human rights goals. One overarching theme, I think, of the discussion was that while local governments are often at the forefront of promoting and protecting human rights or engaging with communities around human rights, very often these debates and discussions take place around the human rights framework at the national level or in international bodies such as this one, and that there is therefore a strong need to ensure that that human rights are popularized within local communities, within the role of local government, that there is strengthened training, and that local government officials see the implementation of human rights and an understanding of the human rights framework as a core part of their mandates, and have the knowledge, the tools and capacity in order to carry that forward. Finally, we have heard about what the Human Rights Council can do to carry these issues forward and to ensure that the debates that we have here, the standard setting that takes place within this room, is carried forward into implementation at the local level, including through local governments. Mention has been made of the UPR, which is a good way for states to bring forward into the discussions in this room what they are doing at the local level in order to implement their international human rights obligations, and also for that to form part of the dialogue within the UPR framework in order to encourage states to remove obstacles and to strengthen the capacity of local government officials to advance human rights. Similarly, there are a number of special procedures who, when conducting country visits or formulating their reports, address critical issues such as water and sanitation, health, housing, education, the right to work, as well as the full range of civil and political rights. And so there is a role for the special procedures to engage with states from all regions in order to strengthen their human rights capacity. There is more that it sounds like the Human Rights Council Advisory Committee is willing to do in order to address these issues, formulate recommendations, and advance this discussion within the Human Rights Council. So I think in the time that we've had a very good discussion covering a broad range of issues. We'll certainly look forward to the High Commissioner's summary of the discussions, and we thank you all very much for your inputs, and I hope you'll join me as well in thanking the panelists for their many contributions and the lead sponsors as well. And with that, I'll pass the floor back to the Vice President for closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. This brings us to the end of the intersessional panel discussion on the role of local government in the promotion and protection of human rights. I wish to thank the Deputy High Commissioner, which just needed to leave earlier, the moderator, participants who have contributed to our discussion. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished colleagues, this brings us to the end of this meeting. Before closing, I've been asked to inform you that the Permanent Mission of the Republic of Korea will be holding a reception immediately after the panel discussion from noon on the balcony between rooms 19 and 20, which is just outside this room. I hereby close this intersessional meeting of the Human Rights Council.